moving on from politics in football, and I suppose linking with politics, but more focusing in on gender issues in football then. Um, so there's very obvious differences between the genders, particularly in football. There's massive issues between um, pay gaps, opportunities, media representation, so many different issues within gender in football specifically. Other sports perhaps don't have as much of an issue. I feel tennis has fairly equal representation. Um, Obviously, there's going to be issues where women are underrepresented, and there's going to be issues where men are underrepresented as well. So, for example, do men have much of an opportunity in netball? You don't see very many men playing netball, do you? Whereas in other sports, women aren't represented as much and aren't given as much opportunity. So there's a lot of point for discussion, I suppose, in terms of gender issues in football. And I guess you can start by talking about just the general stereotypes within football and within sport as a whole, I suppose. So, general stereotypes in sport, then. You've got this assumption that men in sport are always muscular, toned, very strong, perhaps more aggressive, and you've got this assumption that men kind of compete stereotypically in sports such as rugby and football. You notice there that within those sports there's a nature of physicality. It's a contact sports where perhaps aggression is key. And then you've got this generalised view that women in sport they participate in sports such as gymnastics and dance, so like contemporary sports where it's perhaps more a performance. It's more like artistic, I suppose, in a way, where they're supposed to be skinny, not as muscular, more toned and skinny. Have to look a certain way. These are, of course, just stereotypes. You have many women who will play rugby, who will play football, men who will do gymnastics and do dance. And luckily, through societal changes, these stereotypes are beginning to disappear slightly. Obviously, it's an ongoing issue that these stereotypes are still present and are cause for perhaps discrimination sometimes as well. For example, often men who participate in sports such as gymnastics will be assumed to be gay because it's not seen as a men's sport. Luckily, these ideologies are slowly changing over time, and it's becoming more accepted that women can participate in whichever sport they like and men can participate in whichever sport they like. It's encouraged more that both genders participate in all sports, which is a positive change for sure, and something that's developed with societal changes and changes in societal views. Obviously, women used to be told to stay at home and they weren't allowed to work and things like that, which would be why they were also told not to participate in sports and things like that. It used to be just men that were allowed to participate in sport, and over time we've developed those societal views and come to realise that men and women are equal. And although we've changed as a society, there are still many issues that we face in sport with gender, and specifically in football as well. So first, we need to look really at the influences over stereotypes and over gender and participation in sport. So I suppose if we start at literally the start of our experiences with sport, if we look at our education, so if you look at infant school or primary school, you generally the general consensus is that you get a broad range of different physical activities. So from gymnastics to dance to football to athletics, you get a range of different activities. Some just game based as well, not specific sports. And generally, at that age, you have mixed teams. There's no separation of boys and girls. It's generally boys and girls mixed together, um, playing together. There's no separation really until perhaps maybe year six, the last year of education in infant school. That's where competitive teams begin. So, for example, it's often that football teams at that age will sometimes become split into girls' football teams and boys' football teams, although often you'll find that there is a lack of girls participating in football, especially when I was younger, which meant that girls had to play in the boys' teams. Now that wasn't an issue for me. I was happy playing with the boys' team because I was just as good as the boys, and at the same level as them, so I had no issue there. Eventually, I was able to split off into girls and boys teams as well, but I continued playing in boys teams until I went up to high school. So there's a clear change when you jump up to high school or secondary school. That's where classes perhaps begin to become separated into girls and boys. Not all schools do that, of course. It's selective. It's dependent on the school, really. But you generally start to have separate groups for the genders, and this is sometimes dependent on what sport you're doing. So, for example, gymnastics and things like that, tennis and things like that, you may not be split, whereas football or rugby, the genders may be split. And is this a gender issue? Is this an issue of girls can't play this sport, boys can't play this sport, or is this a case of teens undergoing puberty at this time, undergoing those physical changes due to their hormones, where boys do have that inherited increase in testosterone, which increases their muscle mass, which gives that physical advantage in sports such as rugby and football. Should they be separated because of that physical advantage that boys have? Or should girls be given that equal opportunity to participate alongside those boys? Should they be given the chance to play or the choice to play with them? And there's a question for debate there, whether it should or whether it shouldn't. And it's something that is very dependent on the school that you go to, in England at least anyway. Not only do students undergo these physical changes as they transition up to secondary school, there's also plenty of social changes as well. Secondary school tends to be where people begin to feel a lot more judgment. There's a lot more judgment between individuals. I don't know whether there's a psychological reason for that or whether it's just a societal thing where they conform to those societal standards where people begin to judge each other more. But as a result of these judgments, people tend to change their views on sport. Girls will often try and get out of doing certain sports because it's seen as that's what they should do. That's what is perceived by those societal standards. And boys will be encouraged to participate in sport as that's what's encouraged, that's what's seen as masculine or what a boy should be doing. And that is a talking point of where we need to change. We need to change those societal standards and have rid of that ideology that girls should be doing this and boys should be doing this. There should be equal opportunity and equal standards for both genders in terms of participation in sport. So what else influences these stereotypes then? So the media is definitely another influencing factor. So how sports are portrayed and how role models are portrayed in the media and the coverage of those role models in the media. If you were to look for a newspaper or look on TV, you would find that there are a lot more male role models in the sporting industry that are covered in the media. There is way more coverage of men's football in newspapers and media outlets than there is of women's football. Is that fair? It could be argued that men's football brings in more money, so that is a reason for them getting more coverage. It could be argued that there are more spectators for men's football. But is it actually fair that men's football, which is so highly promoted and doesn't need the extra help, gets the extra promotion, where women's football does not? It's again another talking point as to whether that should be the case or not. Should you have that inequality in the media? I think there should be equal coverage in the media, and the coverage shouldn't be based on gender at all. Young children who watch television will be, so young girls, for example, they might be watching football, and the only football that is covered that they can watch is men's football. There isn't anywhere near as much coverage of women's football in the media. So all they see is these men playing football. There's no women for them to look up to because they aren't being covered enough in the media. What message does that send to those young girls? Realistically, it sends a message that they shouldn't be participating in football. We need that equal coverage in the media in order to encourage both boys and girls to participate in all sports. And the same, of course, goes for coverage of men in other sports. So it might be more common to see females playing netball. And of course, females are the predominant participants in netball from a youth age up till professional stage. Is that because there's more coverage of females playing netball? There's not as much opportunity for boys to play netball. Again, there needs to be that equal opportunity, that boys need to be shown that netball is a pathway for them. It needs to be more accessible for them. We need to eradicate these stereotypes of women playing this sport, men playing this sport, in order to have an equal number of role models in each sport for young children to look up to. These stereotypes and these lack of coverage of role models are the reason that young children don't have these people to look up to and to encourage them to participate in that sport, because they're not seeing someone that is like them. Young people look to people who are like them, who are inspiring, who they could look to be in the future. And if there isn't anyone for them to look for that, they're much less likely to participate in those sports. And that's where we need equality in terms of gender in the media, as media has inequality at the moment, and it's very reflective on the participation rates of genders in football, in other sports as well.